Okay. On behalf of and the American Arbitration Association, ICDR Asia Case Management Center, I warmly welcome you all on what promises to be a stimulating discussion on the Vodafone versus India investment treaty arbitration case. Why are we discussing a singular investment treaty arbitration case on a webinar? Does it deserve special attention? Well, my brief answer is indeed it does. For the in-depth answers, we have a stellar panel today. For the benefit of our attendees, let me briefly provide a background to the dispute so that we can appreciate the issues and implications of the arbitral award. In 2007, Hutchison Telecommunications International Limited, a Cayman Islands entity, let's call it Hutch, sold its stake in CGP Investments, another Cayman entity, to Vodafone International Holdings, a Netherlands entity, for a consideration of $11.1 billion. Hutch earned capital gains on the sale to Vodafone Netherlands. CGP Investments, that is the sold Cayman entity, held various underlying subsidiaries in Mauritius. These, along with certain Indian companies, ultimately held 67% in Hutchison SR Limited, an Indian company. The Indian revenue authorities considered that Vodafone Netherlands' indirect acquisition of shares in Hutchison India was liable for tax deduction at source under the then existing provisions of the Indian Income Tax Act of 1961. As Vodafone Netherlands had failed to withhold Indian taxes on payments made to Hutch, the Cayman entity, a tax demand of $2.1 billion was raised on Vodafone Netherlands. This tax demand was challenged by Vodafone in Bombay High Court. The Bombay High Court upheld the tax demand. This was challenged again by Vodafone before the Supreme Court of India. The Honorable Supreme Court quashed the demand. However, the Supreme Court decision was subsequently overridden by the Indian Parliament, and respective legislation was passed, effective from 1961 when the Income Tax Act came into force, through which certain amendments or clarification, as contended by India, were made that had the effect of reinstating the tax demand. Vodafone then challenged the conduct of India and the imposition of tax liability under the India-Netherlands Bilateral Investment Protection Agreement. The International Arbitral Tribunal held that India was in breach of international law for imposition of tax liability on a foreign investor, and directed India to cease its conduct in imposing liability on Vodafone, failing which India could attract international responsibility. So the Vodafone versus India case is unique in as much as it restrains a state from acting under its own legislation and is one among less than a handful of investment treaty arbitration cases that stand close in terms of facts and circumstances. And this is why we have with us a stellar, diverse panel from across the globe to provide expert insight into why this case deserves attention and what it entails for foreign investors and states. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you Sophie Nappert, Arbitrator 3 Verulam Building, London, Francis Xavier, Regional Head Dispute Resolution, Raja and Tan, Singapore, Samantha Rowe, Partner, Debevoise and Plimpton, London, Agarwal, Partner, Three Crowns, London, Vyapak Desai, Head International Dispute Resolution and Investigations Practice, Nishit Desai Associates, and I, Shama Loya, I'm a leader in the International Dispute Resolution and Investor State Arbitration Practice at Nishit Desai Associates. This webinar is conducted in association with AAA ICDR Asia Case Management Center, Singapore, and the ICDR Young and International, both of which remain supporting and eager to discuss challenging issues in the world of international arbitration. With that, let me open the session. And if time permits, we will have a Q&A session for our attendees. Francis, my first question is to you. What are the unique aspects of the investor-state dispute between Vodafone Group and the Republic of India? How is it different from most investment treaty arbitrations?
Well, I think in the first place, Shama, we need to realize that the treaty kicks in the minute Netherlands entity has an investment in India. And because Vodafone Netherlands indirectly held shares in Hutchison SR through the purchase, that qualified. So Vodafone had an investment, which then kicked in the BIT. I think there are two features which you've mentioned are the central, I think the peculiarities of the case. First of all, you had an adverse decision, a decision of the highest court in India, the Supreme Court, which was adverse to the position taken by the state, the host state. And then coupled with that, you had retrospective legislation post the adverse Supreme Court decision to undo the impact or the effect of the Supreme Court decision. So I think this is what makes the Vodafone case unique. Shyama, back to you.
Thank you, Francis. Indeed, the Vodafone India case is a rare investment treaty case where the judiciary quashed a tax demand by the executive, and the parliament subsequently overrid the judiciary and reinstated the tax demand by the executive, dating back to more than half a century ago. But states have the power to legislate, and in the manner they deem fit in accordance with their domestic law, either retrospectively or prospectively. Sophie, how does a state's sovereign right to pass legislation interfere with legitimate expectations of foreign investors? Under what circumstances can retrospective legislation that affects foreign investment attract international responsibility of the state?
Thank you very much, and thank you. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here on this panel. On this question, Kshama, I think there is a balance, as always, between what the state expects itself that it can do and its sovereignty, and what the investor can expect. And I have the following perhaps considerations to put forward. On the one hand, a state is rightly concerned about the corporate avoidance of capital gains tax in the state where the underlying assets, in the case of an indirect transfer of assets, are located. And that concern is recognized at the highest levels by multinational initiatives, such as the Taxation of Offshore Indirect Transfers Toolkit, which is a joint effort of the IMF, the OECD, the UN, and the World Bank. And it actually references, the toolkit references the Vodafone case as an illustration. In a case such as this one, where you have three important factors, the first is that the sums at stake are very large. The indirectly transferred asset is a business whose value derived from a concession granted by the government of the country where the asset was located. And that country is a developing country that is being denied a substantial source of revenue. So that concern of the state has to be legitimate and understandable. And then obviously, on the other side of the scales, you have the legitimate expectations of an investor under international law. And those legitimate expectations, especially of an investor as sophisticated as Vodafone, must be exactly that. They must be legitimate and they must be reasonable. We all know that ISDS tribunals have been criticized in the past for their unbridled interpretation of the term. So the questions to ask in considering whether that there is a breach that would attract the state liability include: what is the historical stance of India on retroactive legislation? What representations, if any, were made to the investor and by whom? Did the investor carry out its due diligence? And how knowledgeable and sophisticated is the investor, and what is its knowledge of the local landscape? So I would say these are the questions that one has to look at. Obviously, we don't know because the text of the award is not public. We do not know in what manner this was considered in the body of the award. But I would imagine this must have been looked at.
Thank you, Sophie. Manish, in light of Sophie's response, if the case involves an investor which has legitimate and reasonable expectations with respect to stability of legal framework of a state, how can states then defend the exercise of their powers to pass retrospective legislations?
Thank you, Shama. And let me start by thanking the organizers for the kind invitation to this very topical debate. As for your question, much will of course turn on the facts of each case, depending upon the design, purpose, and mode of implementing the law in question, its effect on the investments, and whether it is generally applicable or targeted. But as a general principle, of course, in developing a retrospective legislation or defending it, a state would need to examine the analytical legal framework that an investor state tribunal will likely adopt when assessing the compatibility of that law with the state's investment duty obligations. And as for this legal framework, in an award that was recently rendered on 31st August in a case called Kevelam versus Spain, an eminent tribunal comprised of Lord Collins, Daniel Bethlehem, and David Hay made a pithy remark, which in my view captures the essence of the preponderance of jurisprudence regarding retroactive laws. And the tribunal held that there is no general principle which prohibits the retroactivity of legislation. And I think the focus is on the term retroactivity, and I'll return to that later. However, the tribunal then went on to say that retroactivity may, depending upon the context, be relevant to unreasonableness, breach of legitimate expectations that Sophie's talked about, or destruction of acquired rights. So the point of departure for a state in terms of the defense is a broad recognition in arbitral jurisprudence of a state's sovereign right to regulate and to change its regulatory framework. But I think at the same time, it is now broadly recognized that that right is not unfettered. It is subject to limitations imposed by the substantive obligation, and the real question is what is the extent and nature of those limitations. Now, focusing on the retrospective nature, I think arbitral jurisprudence reveals a focus on what is the kind of the precise nature of the backward-looking intertemporal effect. There are degrees of retrospectivity, and broadly speaking, there are two main types, with a distinction that is not often recognized in some of the commentary we've seen on the award. It's a distinction between retrospective and retroactive. And retrospective statute operates for the future only, but looks backwards in that it attaches new consequences for the future to existing investments, right? So if you apply a change in law, not only to potential new investments made after the laws enter into force, but also to existing investments, that is a retrospective law. Retroactive statute, on the other hand, operates backwards as of a time prior to its enactment. And it provides that as at a past date, the law shall be taken to have been that which it is not. And I think in the Vodafone case, that is an important distinction, because there's a whole debate about whether the law is merely clarificatory of the law as it stood, or is it creating a new basis for liability? And that distinction can be critical in terms of international wrongfulness. And let's take the two main standards of protection, the FET standard. Sophie's already talked about an assessment of the protection of an investor's legitimate and reasonable expectation, and the factors that the tribunal will consider. And of course, the state will then have to kind of address those factors primarily by reference to the specificity of the representation, the legitimacy of the expectation. But picking up on a point that, Shama, you raised in your question, the tribunals may also, depending upon the treaty, look at the FET standard as preserving the stability and predictability of the legal and investment framework. And the preponderance of jurisprudence indicates that a retroactive law might be found to be a drastic or a radical change and to be a breach of a host state's obligation regarding stability and predictability. You find that in Reef and Spain, for example, where the tribunal said that it had no hesitation in finding that the Spain's measures regarding renewables had a retroactive element to them, and therefore they were in breach of the stability obligation. Now, leaving aside the stability aspect, of course, in investment treaty jurisprudence, you also look at the reasonableness or proportionality of a state's measure. And again, a retroactive law with backward effect may have difficulties in terms of passing that muster, because to just kind of play the devil's advocate, reasonableness requires an assessment of the legitimacy of a state's objective and the suitability of the measure regarding that objective. And Sophie's kind of presented one side of the argument, which is the concern, the public purpose that may have driven the law. You may well have a debate on the other side as to whether a purely retroactive tax measure, the purpose of which is to fill the coffers of the state, as opposed to pursuing a public health or an environmental purpose, meets that criterion of a legitimate public purpose. And I think finally, on the doctrine of acquired rights, you kind of, it takes you into the territory of expropriation, and states often will either attack a claim on the basis that the measure in question has not resulted in a substantial deprivation of the economic use or value of the investment, and I think that is something that is controversial, is that the measure is a generally applicable bona fide regulatory measure reflecting a legitimate exercise of police powers, which attracts no duty of compensation. And again, one can have a debate as to whether police powers as a doctrine of customary international law can be imported into a treaty standard when the same criteria are also embodied in the treaty as criteria for lawfulness. But I think those are the kind of the two main protections which a state will have to kind of worry about in terms of the retroactive legislation.
Thank you so much, Manish. That was extremely helpful. And picking on that point, whether legislation or whether the impact of state measure is proportionate or not, let me move on to Vyapak. Vyapak, having closely analyzed the Vodafone case from India for the last 13 years since its inception in 2007, do you believe that the amendment in 2012 was disproportionate and eroded investor confidence in the Indian legal framework? Could India have adopted less disproportionate alternative or any other kind of measures?
Sure. So, first of all, thanks AAA ICDF for co-hosting this webinar with us, and particularly Smriti Ramesh, who I understand has been instrumental in getting this done. So thanks a lot for doing this. Coming to the question, and I think it is important that we bring in the context, because till date we have been talking about this investment treaty arbitration without too much of information as to what is going on during or as part of the arbitration, because a lot of that is confidential. As so said, of course we are not privy to the full award, but at least some portion of the text in terms of the operational part of the award is still available in the public domain. And I think apart from holding that tribunal has jurisdiction to deal with this under the India and Netherlands BIT, and Vodafone is obviously entitled to the protection of the guarantee of fair and equitable treatment, which is the FET clause which we are talking about. One has to see what is of because through what they say in terms of putting the liability on the government of India. They say that the conduct of the respondent, which is the government of India, in respect of imposition of the claimant of an accepted ability to tax, notwithstanding the Supreme Court judgment, is in breach of the FET clause. Now, I think if I read this, little more closely and think about it, possibly what went wrong, and then I'll come to your question as to what could have been done possibly, is manner and the time in which the amendment came in, just 2 months after the judgment, as you narrated the dates and events at the start. Judgment of Supreme Court came in January 2012. Amendment came in March 2012, and it basically took away what judgment said and brought back the demand on Vodafone, taking away the benefit Vodafone got out of the Supreme Court judgment. So what went wrong, right? Now, taking a step back, if you really see the history of India in terms of BITs, we have been having BITs since decades now. I think first UK India BIT was in 90s, possibly early 90s. And since then, we have several BITs, some of them now uh, terminated, some are being renegotiated. But it's not that India was new to BIT regime. But till 2012, and on the side when white industries, India lost around that time, so far as their commitment to, judicial access and the other parts which white industries said. But what happened with Vodafone is, and possibly that's what went through in the process of arbitration, is the manner and the process in which the amendment was brought in, only to address what they lost in the Supreme Court judgment. So one way to look at it is, what if the amendment was brought in before the Supreme Court judgment, and then the tax demand was made, right? Maybe, like Manish and Sophie were saying, there may be certain arguments in defense of India that this was not done for a particular purpose or something which was, against fair and equitable treatment, everyone at par, and it could have been very different, but that's not the case. So I think in most of these cases, and particularly when there is a question of proportionality and fair and equitable treatment, I think where, India and maybe other countries also go wrong is the manner and the process in which some of these measures are taken. I think so long as there is some kind of a restraint followed as to how these measures are implemented, the objective behind bringing in this kind of a legislation or this kind of an clarificatory amendment, which changes the law since, more than 50 years date back. I think there has to be much more discussion, debate, and focus on why such an amendment was necessary at that point in time, what was the discussion behind it, and whether this was only done to undo what was done by Supreme Court, or whether this was done legitimately, beyond targeting one entity in that sense. So I think where possibly India went wrong is to justify the measures taken rather than the measure itself. Because if you cut the measure from the facts and then look at it, if you can justify it, maybe you can come to a different conclusion. And what the government can do now, maybe we'll discuss that little later as we go along on this debate. But on a lighter note, whether Vodafone would have want something different, I think on a lighter note, I say that, look, I think Vodafone is the biggest beneficiary of this litigation. The amount of branding they got out of this litigation in India, I think, the front page of all Business Times and everywhere else in India, it was only about Vodafone. So I think their cost of branding is possibly their cost of tax, but that's obviously a lighter note. But yeah, I think there is a lot that this government now, while responding to this award, do to bring back the investor confidence. Because as you rightly said, 2012 and onwards, this was the starting point where India lost a lot of investor confidence, maybe through perception, maybe through some of the important other facts which came about because of the 2G license revocation and other things, which all clubbed into one. But definitely Vodafone contributed to a lot of loss of investor confidence when such a retrospective amendment was brought in.
Thank you so much, Vyapak. So what I hear you say is that the problem is not in the measure, but in the manner in which it is taken. And we all recognize that tax is a sovereign function of the state. Picking on that point, Samantha.
And just to add, And just to add why,
Sure.
as I said, the the language used, at least in the the operational part of the award, specifically puts a sentence which says, notwithstanding the Supreme Court order. So I think definitely the timing and the manner in which the measure came in was, in my view, important factor rather than the measure itself.
Absolutely. We discuss about taxation being a sovereign function of the state. What is the rationale behind providing special treatment to taxation measures in a state's legal framework and correspondingly carrying that to BITs, which provide special treatment to taxation measures or completely exclude taxation measures from their ambit?
Sharma, and thank you very much for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to take part in this panel. It feels like it wouldn't be right to have a webinar today without a reference to the US Supreme Court. And luckily for us, Justice Peckham very pithily summed up the importance of taxation to sovereigns in 1899, when he wrote, "The power to tax is one great power upon which the whole national fabric is based. It is as necessary to the existence and prosperity of the nation as the air he breathes is to the natural man. It is not only the power to destroy, but also the power to keep alive." So in other words, the power to tax is inherent to the notion of sovereignty. Taxation is the primary source of revenue for the government. That revenue goes into the public purse. And in an ideal world, at least, it is spent on the public good. Healthcare, education, social security, of course, of particular relevance today, and major infrastructure projects. It's also an important tool in a government's fiscal policy for managing macroeconomic conditions, driving demand, growth, investment. And it's also a tool for encouraging and discouraging broader behavior too. Think about carbon emissions tax or the supersized drinks tax in New York. And for all of these reasons, states want to have free rein when it comes to setting and perhaps more importantly, changing their tax policy. But it's equally a prerogative of states to enter into international obligations that place limitations upon their ability to regulate. And that's equally the case in the sphere of taxation as it is in other areas of regulation too. And that's why we have seen certain states seek to exclude tax measures from the ambit of the obligations that they owe to foreign investors under bilateral investment treaties and also multilateral investment treaties. The Energy Charter Treaty has perhaps one of the most comprehensive exclusions. Article 21 of that treaty says, except as otherwise provided in this article, nothing in this treaty shall create rights or impose obligations with respect to taxation measures of the contracting parties. But even there, I mean, as the article itself said, there are exclusions within the treaty itself. And a number of tribunals have said that a tax measure has to be bona fide, i.e. there can't be a sort of ulterior motive behind it in order to qualify for the exclusion. But in other treaties, the exclusion is much more circumscribed. So of course, in each case, you really have to look to the wording of the specific treaty to see exactly what it was that the contracting parties intended to exclude.
Thank you, Samantha. So, treaty which specifically excluded taxation measures. Let us look at Article 4 of the India-Netherlands Bilateral Investment Protection Agreement. I'm just going to share the screen and I have questions for Sophie, Manish, and Francis on Article 4 of the India-Netherlands BIT. This is Article 4, which deals with national treatment and most favored nation treatment. Samantha, I'm sorry, Sophie, the question is for you. The stance of India has been that taxation disputes are not covered under the India-Netherlands Treaty by virtue of Article 4 of the treaty. If you were counsel for India, how would you interpret Article 4 of the India-Netherlands Treaty? And more importantly, Article 4, subclause 4. which I have highlighted here for the benefit of our attendees.
Thank you very much, Kshama. I mean, it has to be said that the language of 4.4 could probably benefit from some editing and clarity. 4.4 is ambiguous. It states, as you can see on the screen, that the provisions of paragraphs 1 and 2, and I quote, in respect of the grant of national treatment and most favored nation treatment, doesn't apply in relation to domestic tax legislation. However, if you look further up in the provision, you can see that only paragraph 2 relates to the grant of national treatment and most favored nation treatment. Paragraph 1 talks about FET and full protection and security standards. So what we know is that the operative part of the award indicates that the tribunal said it had jurisdiction to consider Vodafone's claim for breach of the BIT on its terms, on its merit, and that by giving tax liability, by holding Vodafone liable for tax, especially in light of the earlier decision of the Supreme Court, then India breached the FET guarantee. It looks, I mean, obviously here I'm speculating because I haven't seen, no one has seen who's not involved with this dispute, the actual reasoning, but it does suggest that the tribunal did not consider it appropriate to give any meaning to the words paragraph 1 in Article 4.4. Otherwise, it would not have assumed jurisdiction over Vodafone's claim. And it can be argued, I would argue, that this is an interpretation that is contrary to the principle of effet utile in treaty interpretation, which requires that the words paragraph 1, which do appear, be given real meaning and effect. Also, if it was plausible to interpret 4.4 as excluding domestic taxation measure from the scope of FET protection in 4.1, then the tribunal should have favored that interpretation unless there was clear evidence of a contrary intention, which perhaps there was, we don't know, but if there weren't, then obviously for me, this is something that is an important argument because, as Samantha has very pithily observed in her presentation, taxation goes to the very core of the sovereignty of a state. And also it goes to the core, and also it touches upon political and social ends that make it ill-fitted to an investment dispute and to an investment treaty as well. So for these reasons, an intention to relinquish sovereignty over this particular function that is taxation should not readily be inferred by an investment tribunal. I'll come back to that a little bit later in the seminar, but these would be my points, hopefully.
Thank you, Sophie. Money counter interpretation if you were counsel for Vodafone.
Thank you, Kshama, and of course, as an arbitration practitioner who acts for both investors and states, I should start with the caveat that the arguments I'm going to outline are being made in the spirit of the debate. And if I were counsel for Vodafone, my argument may go as follows. In order to determine what disputes fall within the jurisdiction of the tribunal, you start with the text of the investor-state dispute resolution provision in Article 9. You don't start with Article 4. And Article 9, just for everyone's benefit, is a broad provision that confers jurisdiction on a tribunal to determine any dispute between an investor of one contracting party and the other contracting party in connection with an investment in the territory of the other contracting party. So it's a generic dispute resolution clause capturing any dispute relating to an investment. The next question is whether there is any other provision in the treaty that carves out any particular category of disputes from the jurisdiction of the tribunal. And it is in this regard that I think the sweeping statement that Article 4 carves out all taxation-related disputes from the jurisdiction of the tribunal is in fact inconsistent with the plain text of Article 4. Even put at its highest, the argument can only be, and I think Sophie presented that well, is that the FET and FPS standards in Article 4.1 and the MFN and national treatment standard in 4.2 do not apply in relation to, in the context of this case, domestic legislation regarding tax or arrangements relating to that. Plainly, that provision does not affect the tribunal's jurisdiction to determine any other disputes relating to an investment, including claims for unlawful expropriation, breach of umbrella clauses, and other substantive protections. So the objection to jurisdiction, as Sophie outlined in the context of this case, is a more limited one. Does Article 4.4 prevent a tribunal from evaluating India's conduct in terms of its compliance with the FET standard in Article 4.1? And as for this point, I expect the investors' arguments to have focused on the fact that Sophie also specifically refers to the treaty provisions in respect of the grant of the national treatment and the most favored nation treatment. And I expect the investor to then support that argument by reference to the supplementary means of interpretation in Article 32 and the broader treaty practice, in which carve-outs from MFN and national treatment are more common. But again, as Sophie recognized, there is this ambiguity, and of course, we do not have the award and the reasoning and the arguments that are advanced. But I think over and above that, you can also anticipate an argument by the investor that what is carved out under 4.4, if you look at its text, is any domestic tax legislation or arrangements consequent to such legislation. And the argument would be that India's wrongful conduct here does not either qualify as or goes much beyond a domestic tax law or arrangements thereunder. And each of those arguments, in turn, having dealt with those as counsel in other cases. First, I think based on the preponderance of jurisprudence, there is an argument that an unreasonable and targeted retroactive measure, which is not a bona fide exercise of taxation power, does not fall within a taxation carve-out, simply because a state calls something a tax is not dispositive under international law, and several tribunals have endorsed this proposition. And in fact, I think the most relevant remark in this context is one made in a case called Encana in Ecuador, where the tribunal stated, and I quote, that a retrospective change in the law, deeming some demand to be covered by a taxation law, which was not so covered at the time, might well not attract immunity from scrutiny under a tax carve-out. And such conduct not involving a taxation measure that violated the treaty at the time it was committed would not acquire the character of a taxation measure for the purpose of the BIT by being retrospectively labeled as such. And you find support for that line of argument in the recent Yukos and Spanish and Czech cases. And of course, you have to then examine each case on its fact. The second point is that there is no bar under Article 4.4 on a tribunal examining the state's conduct as a whole against the FET standard, particularly where the alleged tax legislation is simply one aspect of the cumulative conduct. And a conduct, as we know, can consist of both acts and omissions. Vyapak has already talked about India's conduct here, and to just give you one example, FET standard requires a state to act consistently, and it is reasonably arguable that what transpired here in terms of the acts of the executive, the tax authorities, the Supreme Court, and the legislature was not really limited to a domestic tax legislation or a measure thereunder, and in fact did not meet that consistency threshold. And in fact, if you look at the operative part of the award, which it seems to suggest that the tribunal indeed take a broader view of India's wrongful conduct, referring to the respondent's conduct in respect of the imposition of the claimant of an asserted liability to tax, notwithstanding the Supreme Court judgment. So there's no, again, we don't have the award, but it doesn't seem to be confined only to a purely retrospective tax legislation. I think the focus is on the conduct as a whole. And I think that is one argument that could again be used to kind of get around the wording of 4.4.
Thank you so much, Manish. Francis, do you have anything to add to what Sophie or Manish have mentioned as for your interpretation of Article 4 and particularly Article 4 subclause?
Well, Shama, I think the ground has been fairly covered by both Sophie and Manish. My own sense is that at the end of the day, the main arguments that would have confronted the tribunal, again, I think all of us are speculating because we don't know what really happened before then and what they ultimately decided. But I suppose the main argument that India would have made, and which I presume it made, would be that the current dispute, which was before the tribunal, was whether the retroactively operating legislation would then mean the dispute over that retroactive effect legislation would mean that that falls fairly and squarely under Article 4, Paragraph 4. Because India will simply say, I am entitled as a host state to carve out areas relating to security, environment, or whatever, away from the entire ISDS scheme in the BIT. And that's exactly what I did in Paragraph 4, which is the provisions of Paragraph 1 shall not apply in respect of any domestic legislation or arrangements consequent to such legislation. Right here, I had the legislation, retrospective or retroactive in effect, although they were retroactive in effect, but they've come within the phrase domestic legislation. So the minute there is domestic legislation, whether retroactive or not, which covers the issue, I've carved it out. And the entire ISDS provisions don't come in, right? Now that's a fairly, it's a serious argument. And I guess the major counter argument, and that's something that Manish touched on, is to say that at the time the investment was made, there was no, the law was that the liability to withhold tax was completely not existent. It was not covered by any domestic legislation, right? Because in 2007, when Vodafone acquired the shares from Hutchinson, and Hutchinson was said to have made the capital gains, at that time, insofar as Vodafone's investment in acquiring the shares was concerned, there was in fact no obligation, Shama, to withhold tax. At that time, there was no applicable domestic legislation or arrangements which created an obligation or duty on the part of Vodafone, right? So the carve-out didn't apply in 2007. And that investment that Vodafone held in 2007 was entitled, therefore, to protection under Paragraph 1, the FET provision. You shall not issue any unreasonable or discriminatory measures against me. Now, India only came within subparagraph 4 of Article 4 in March 2012 when it enacted laws taking effect from April 2012. So the tribunal could say, I'm entitled to consider whether that retrospective legislation breaches Paragraph 1. Now, you can see it's a very convoluted analytical framework. But, as Sophie has said, the problem arises because subparagraph 4 is not clearly worded. If India wanted to have a very clear carve-out, then perhaps subparagraph 4 should have said, any dispute over the applicability or the validity of any legislation, domestic legislation relating wholly or mainly to taxation would not fall within the ambit of this treaty, right? Something or words to that effect, then I think will be very clear. But that's not what paragraph 4 says. Unfortunately, paragraph 4 says, paragraph 1 shall not apply to any domestic legislation or arrangements consequent to such legislation. Arguably, in 2007, there was no domestic taxation legislation that applied to Vodafone's acquisition of shares, as the Supreme Court found in January 2012. We don't know what ultimately the tribunal found, but we can only divine that this is the argument that found favor with the tribunal. Shama?
Thank you so much, Francis, Sophie. Those are extremely interesting interpretations of art. I can only hope that this interpretation at least comes out in the public domain so we are better able to appreciate Article 4 the way in which it is drafted. Samantha, moving on to another aspect of the dispute. While Vodafone Netherlands entity initiated arbitration under the India-Netherlands Investment Protection Agreement, and India made out a jurisdictional objection under the India-Netherlands treaty, Vodafone PLC, which is the parent company in UK, initiated under the UK BIT to circumvent this jurisdictional objection. Now, was it plausible to invoke the India-UK BIT to circumvent the jurisdiction or the tax exclusion as contended by India under the India-Netherlands BIT? How far is this permissible, and what are the contours of this strategy?
I think it's quite difficult to say that it wasn't plausible. And just to provide a little bit of additional background for the benefit of the attendees today, when Vodafone PLC filed its arbitration under the UK BIT, India sought and obtained an ex parte anti-suit injunction restraining Vodafone PLC from initiating or continuing the proceedings. But the Delhi High Court later vacated the stay and dismissed the proceedings brought by India and found that multiple claims initiated by various companies in a corporate chain does not per se result in an abusive process. And an anti-suit injunction could be granted only if the proceedings were oppressive, vexatious, inequitable, or resulted in an abusive process. And the court further noted that the proceedings under the UK BIT, as you said, Sharma, they were in essence a hedge against the potential jurisdictional objections under the Netherlands BIT. And so for the court, this wasn't an abusive process, but rather a legitimate effort by Vodafone to secure a remedy to which they were entitled under international law. And as Anglo-Saxon lawyers, I think for us, the concept of abusive right or abusive process is a little bit alien. You know, have a right, then you're entitled to use it. And in this case, Vodafone Netherlands had a right under the Netherlands BIT to bring an arbitration, and Vodafone PLC had a right under the UK BIT to bring a separate arbitration. And that really seems to be what the Delhi court was getting at when they said this wasn't abusive because it was all about securing a remedy. And of course, as we've said earlier in the webinar, you know, what we would call derivative claims under domestic law are the norm in investment treaty arbitration. It's usual for a shareholder to be bringing a claim in respect of its investment in the host state. And that's equally true for indirect and for minority shareholders too. So there's nothing there that would prevent a shareholder or various shareholders at various points in the corporate chain from bringing their claim. And certainly in my own experience, you know, we've filed parallel claims by different entities in corporate chains against the same respondent state in relation to the same harm. And I sort of come back to this same point. It's a hedge because there are always risks under different treaties. There are risks in relation to different jurisdictional objections might be raised. There are risks simply in relation to how different tribunals might approach different sets of facts. But far from seeking to be oppressive or vexatious, we've sought to make that those parallel claims as efficient as possible, in particular by seeking to consolidate proceedings. And actually, in our experience, it has sometimes been the respondent state that's resisted that. And this was true in one of the first cases to deal with this issue of parallel claims, CME and Lauda and Czech Republic. And the Czech Republic in those two cases complained about the multiple proceedings and said, look, this is basically the same case, it's the same harm, it's the same remedy that's being sought, just in one case by the ultimate shareholder and in the other case by the more direct shareholder in the corporate chain. And the response of both tribunals to the Czech Republic was, you had the opportunity to consolidate these arbitrations, and it was you who insisted on having two different tribunals. And we can deal with any of the issues thrown up by the existence of parallel proceedings when it comes to damages. In other words, we're not going to allow double recovery. And actually, interestingly, those two cases show you why, as counsel for a claimant, you might want to think about whether there are different treaties available to different claimants in your corporate chain, because the two tribunals in those cases reach quite different conclusions on the merits of the case. So coming back to your question about what the contours of this strategy might be, as far as I'm aware, only one tribunal has actually dismissed a claim based on multiple proceedings being brought by different claimants within the same corporate group. And that was Orascom and Algeria, another telecommunications case. But that was quite a unique set of circumstances. The parallel claim in that case had actually resulted in a settlement and a consent award. So in other words, I think that was really a double recovery issue that we were looking at. And I think if we look at the current state of the law, that is probably where the contours of the strategy lie. You cannot recover twice for the same harm. But I think that the current state of the case will certainly suggest that tribunals will be quite permissive when it comes to different corporate entities bringing separate claims under different treaties.
Thank you, Samantha. You're actually relied upon by the Delhi High Court in Vodafone case. Initially, when the Delhi High Court actually restrained the proceedings by way of an ad interim injunction, later on vacated it to allow the proceedings under the India-UK BIT to continue. So going back to a more general concept on group of companies doctrine, Sophie, how far do you believe the group of companies doctrine, Samantha mentioned chain, a corporate chain where various entities can file a case against the state for the same harm, how far can this doctrine be used to initiate parallel claims in investment treaty arbitrations? I understand, yes, that in the Vodafone case, the Delhi High Court did not find this to be abusive, but does the use of the group of companies doctrine necessitate certain safeguards to mitigate abuse of process?
Thank you. I take a slightly different stance. First of all, I will say just generally that the laissez-faire approach that Samantha outlined in allowing shareholders or related companies to bring claims, I think plays squarely into the hands of the critics of investment treaty arbitration, because the potential for conflicting decisions, the perception that the state is being essentially cornered by, large companies, is the optics are just dreadful. Anyway, but to my mind, the group of companies doctrine could be used to preclude concurrent claims by companies related to the same group with respect of the same dispute. So it would be the flip side of what you usually see it used for, to attract non-signatories to an arbitration. So the group of companies doctrine in the UK, for example, is not being recognized in English law precisely because it is considered to be too permissive, and the potential for abuse is real. But in a case like this, you could use the flip side of it by precluding related companies to go after the state for the same dispute. So that's the way that I would see it as being useful.
Thank you for this flip side to the group of companies doctrine. So let's move on to the implications of the award. Now, Francis, do you believe that India has valid grounds to challenge the award under the laws of Singapore, which was the seat of the arbitration? I know the award is not public, but do you perceive any valid grounds for India to challenge the award?
Well, Shama, I think based on the limited material that's available for our eyes, I guess there are 2 points that immediately sort of emerge subject to the views of the other panelists. And the first is what we have been focused on, right? And both those points relate to jurisdiction. So the first point would be, does the carve-out in Article 4, subparagraph 4, is it effective here, right? Because the carve-out says the FET protection in paragraph 1, which was ultimately what the tribunal found against India, they had breached the FET protection. Paragraph 4 of Article 4 says the FET protection does not apply if you have domestic legislation which pertains to taxation. And here you have domestic legislation that pertains to taxation. The only difference being it was retrospective. So what? Article 4 doesn't say only non-retrospective legislation, then you cover, right? So India will say, even though it could be clearer, but whatever it is, what is there is enough to carve this dispute out of the BIT. And if that is a correct view of paragraph 4, then the tribunal would not have had jurisdiction. That's, well, of course, that's a big debate, right? And who knows what the Singapore court would decide. But the second point, and I really don't know the answer to this, it's just, you know, when I read the papers, it jumped out at me, but I don't know whether the argument was live before the tribunal or not, relates to Article 4, subparagraph 5, which I don't think you flashed, but that paragraph says, Shama, dispute resolution under Article 9, which is the paragraph that Manish referred to, which is the entire, you know, the ancestral arbitration seated in Singapore. Dispute resolution under Article 9 shall only be applicable for the BIT in the absence of a normal local judicial remedy being available. So this is the exhaustion of local remedies. If Vodafone had a remedy in India, apart from running off to ISDS, then it should explore that. And so Article 4, subparagraph 5 would say, if there was such a viable remedy, you can't start ISDS under the BIT. And I'm reliably informed by Nishit Desai's paper, being experts on Indian law, that Vodafone could have exercised the right to challenge the constitutionality of the retrospective or retroactive legislation before the Indian Supreme Court. And they didn't do that. The question then becomes, in those circumstances, if that is correct, that they had a local recourse in India, and they didn't exhaust it, then surely India could argue that the tribunal had no jurisdiction. Local remedies were simply not exhausted. And that will go to the very root of jurisdiction of the tribunal. I don't know whether this argument was raised or whether it was considered by the tribunal. But those are the only two grounds that it seems to me, based on the limited material available to us, could be run by India if it wished to set aside the enforcement of the award, or set aside either set aside the award or resist enforcement. Shama, back to you.
Shama, just
Francis. Yes, yeah.
Just wanted to
Sorry,
pick up
Manish.
on the second argument that Francis identified, and again, kind of just, you know, to encourage a debate. I think there is a counter argument in that the provision is limited to claims relating to breaches of umbrella clauses, because it starts by referring to a state's obligation to observe any obligations it may have entered into with respect to investments, and then goes on to say, provided that, and I think that language of provided that dispute resolution under Article 9 shall only be applicable in the absence of a normal local judicial remedy being available. And that issue has come up in prior cases where what that provision is in fact designed to do is to prevent an investor from circumventing any jurisdiction clauses that may be contained in the contract by simply bringing a claim for breach of the umbrella clause in the treaty. But I think the counter argument would be that proviso only operates in that limited context, in the context of a claim for breach of umbrella clauses, but is not more widely applicable in the context of the dispute resolution under Article 9. I think that is, if such an argument is raised, as Francis has rightly identified, I think that would be the rebuttal from the other side.
This is so engaging and stimulating that I wish we could have an hour or 1 hour to absolutely have a mock hearing here for the state and the investor. Unfortunately, I have to trim this down and move on to the next question. And that question is more on enforcement. Let's believe that Vodafone does pass the hurdle, across the hurdle of challenge in Singapore and has the award now that's ready for enforcement and potential enforcement in India. Vyapak, you have extensively handled relating to enforcement of foreign arbitral awards in India. In light of some recent Indian court decisions, which I'm actually expecting you to enlighten our audience on, could Vodafone face any hurdles in India during enforcement of the award? From your experience, how can it navigate these hurdles?
So if you are doing business, bound to be there. So I don't think anybody can expect smooth run so far as India is concerned. But I think this also answers one of the questions which has been raised on the chat box by Pawan Singh as to why Singapore has the jurisdiction. And the reason why that is so, because the seat for arbitration was Singapore, and therefore the court of jurisdiction for challenge would be Singapore. Possibly that at least answers one of the questions on the Q&A panel. But coming to the hurdles on enforcement, now apart from the usual challenges that we face for any enforcement of foreign award in any other country, I am not going into that because time is short and I think we have already run more than an hour now. But to be precise, in fact, in one of the Vodafone decisions, which I think Sophie also referred and you also referred with regard to the injunction regarding the UK BIT case raised by the group entity of Vodafone for the same cause of action, Delhi High Court has actually made an observation to say that BIT proceedings, and particularly a BIT award, would not fall under the contours of New York Convention Award for enforcement of a foreign award under Arbitration and Conciliation Act 1996. Now, this is Delhi High Court. We obviously don't have a Supreme Court judgment on this, and this Delhi High Court judgment was then followed, or at least referred, I would not use the word followed, but at least referred in court judgment in Khaitan Holdings, which tend to suggest that so far as India is concerned, at the moment the position is that BIT is not part of Arbitration and Conciliation Act 1996, which governs both domestic arbitration and the domestic award enforcement and foreign award enforcement under Part 2, which are under New York Convention. So if that is the position which continues, possibly, then India will be again in a unique situation compared to most of the other countries. Don't have a regime for enforcement of a BIT award, more particularly when India is also not signed up to the ICSID convention, which means the award stands in a no man's land. Does that mean that you have to actually file a original action or a suit to enforce a BIT award and therefore stay in or be in the queue for enforcement, and you don't have any methodology? Or that would be expounded to involve and include a BIT award, though it may not be strictly commercial as excuse me, the exception taken under the New York Convention by India. So I think this is going to be a pretty steep battle if they have to actually enforce. and India is not, either challenging and setting aside the award or at least agreeing to the award. My sense is India may challenge for the grounds Francis suggested, or there may be other reasons for challenge, but subject to this, I don't expect an Indian government to go rogue in sense, if it ultimately comes to enforcement, I don't think, India would act in a way that it would, further dampen the, foreign investment market. So I think while it's a great legal debate and we can, keep talking about it, but I hope we don't have to actually debate it in a court when it comes for enforcement.
Thank you, Vyapak. Very positive note. And before I move on to some quick questions for our panelists, Manish, could you just let us know or let the attendees know if there are any parallels in investor-state disputes history for the Vodafone case?
Thank you, Shamana. I think I can be quite brief on this. Francis and others have already talked about how the matter is unique. I think just from a purely kind of legal level, as an investment TD practitioner, I don't believe that the issues of jurisdiction, liability, and remedies are entirely novel, or that we find ourselves in uncharted territory. And I think courtesy Ecuador, Russia, and Spain, there are now 50 odd investment TD cases, mostly in the energy and renewable and natural resources sector, that have grappled with similar issues, regarding taxation carve-outs, similar to Article 4.4, the balance between a host state's right to regulate, including to enact retroactive or retrospective measures, and investor protection. So there is guidance available in our jurisprudence. And just to name a few cases for the benefit of the audience, I mentioned Ecuador. You have the Ecuadorian VAT cases going all the way back to 2004 with Occidental and Cana. Then you have a whole series of cases arising from so-called windfall taxes enacted by Ecuador that resulted in a whole series of cases again. And I'm sure most are familiar with the UCOS matters, where again the issue of the application of taxation carve-out was quite an important one. And I think the argument that I outlined earlier about how a targeted retroactive measure could be characterized as not being a tax measure that falls within a tax carve-out is something that the UCOS line of cases are now given some support to, and we find that debate being carried over into the ECT jurisprudence in cases involving Spain, Czech Republic, and Italy. So there are parallels in the sense that the legal issues have been dealt with, but I think where you may not necessarily find a parallel, going back to the point that Vyapak made, is the manner of implementation of the change, where I don't think that issues kind of come squarely before a treaty tribunal.
Thank you, Manish. And now let me move to some seeking quick view of the panelists. The Vodafone versus India case has all the elements that stir a backlash to investor-state arbitration. Sophie and Francis, how would you support the argument that an arbitral tribunal has jurisdiction to declare a parliamentary legislation of a sovereign nation as unenforceable and restrain its operation under international law? Sophie and then Francis, what would be your view? How would you support that argument?
Setting aside the taxation carve-out for a minute in the Vodafone case, the answer to that question for me would be that the jurisdiction to declare that legislation unenforceable is that it is incompatible with treaty obligations to which India has voluntarily, or a country has voluntarily subscribed.
Francis?
Yeah, I mean, usually, I mean, this is quite common in the sense that how does a foreign investor's rights in his investment in a host state get impaired? And it's fairly common that they get impaired by way of legislation, take the Philip Morris case, the Australian plain packaging laws. They can also be impaired by subsidiary legislation and executive fiat, cancellation of licenses, mining licenses. So it is the nature of the beast that arbitral tribunals, treaty tribunals will sit in judgment of sovereign country, entities, legislation, either principal or subsidiary. It's just the nature of the beast. If you want to protect FDI, that's the terrain.
And Samantha, Manish, and Vyapak, in that order, how would you come to this view that an arbitral tribunal does not have jurisdiction to declare a legislation as unenforceable because that's the sovereign right of a nation? Samantha.
So I think it's important. Thanks, Sharma. I think it's important to be precise, and actually I think that the backlash in this respect is based on a little bit of a misconception. The tribunal didn't say that India's tax legislation is unenforceable as a general matter. It only has jurisdiction over the relationship between India and this investor, and it held that the legislation cannot be enforced against this particular claimant in the particular manner in which India was trying to enforce it, because that infringes the FET obligation under the BIT. I think that's an important difference. And I think as well, if you look at the operative part of the award, India has a choice: cease the conduct in question, or your international responsibility will be engaged, which presumably will be accompanied by an obligation to pay damages.
Manish?
I don't think I have anything to add to what others have said, other than recall. I think the from a pure kind of public international perspective, I think the argument from the investor side would be that, as Samantha said, what the tribunal has done here is simply require India to seize what was characterized as an internationally wrongful act. And I think there's an argument that consequence, as embodied in Article 30 of the ILC articles, is customary international law. And there is no undue infringement of the state sovereignty insofar as all that the tribunal has ordered is to require the state to seize that act, leaving it to the state to then choose its own means, as Samantha said, to decide how it would do that, rather than finding the law itself to be unenforceable as a whole or annulling a law. I don't think that they've gone that far.
No, that's true.
Yeah,
no, that's true, because I think we started our discussion. I don't think, if someone goes as far as saying the measure itself or the right or the power to enact a legislation or even correct it or clarify it can ever be challenged, in terms of, any violation of FET or otherwise. I think possibly that's the reason why even the tribunal went the way to simply say that don't take any further recourse in this case, particularly in light of the facts of this case, rather than saying that such a clarification itself is right or wrong. So I think somewhere there is a way out for the parties here. Of course, Indian government has their own right to challenge on legal grounds, and I don't think that can be taken away just because there is an award. But in my view, that's where there is a via media to resolve this. That's what I see.
Thanks, Vyapak. The general international view put the case to rest and not challenge the award. But on the other hand, there is a general notion that the manner in which the dispute or award will be handled by India today could influence the course of proceedings in similar cases, such as in Cairn and Vedanta disputes. So Sophie and Francis, what would be your one argument in favor of India challenging the award in light of other pending claims?
Well, from a very selfish perspective, I would very much want to do for them to do it because it will make the award public, which is going to be something nice, jurisprudence-wise. From an investment arbitration law perspective, I think this is a case that goes beyond India's context. It highlights once again what I was saying earlier about the fact that taxation is very ill-fitted to investment disputes because of its political and social ramifications, and the fact that a private tribunal collides with these aims of a taxation measure. And this, as Manish has mentioned quite rightly, was very well illustrated in the UCOS Awards by the disastrous treatment of the tax provision in the Energy Charter Treaty, which has been upheld in an earlier decision this year by the Dutch Court of Appeal. So I guess I'm wrong on this one, but it would provide a lot of clarity, I think, for the field in order to have the treatment of taxation, and for states as well, to have the treatment of taxation measures in investment law, settled, as opposed to being in the unsettled state that we have now.
Thanks, Sophie. Francis?
Well, you see, I think we've gone into quite a bit of discussion on the issues that arise, and it's not clear. The terrain is not clear. It's not black letter clarity on what is the right position. I think, Manish helpfully countered my principal argument on 4.5. Yes, and that's the beauty of international arbitration, especially treaty arbitration. The level of arguments you can make is only limited by the creativity and ingenuity of counsel. So this is one case where I think it's not, one would find it difficult to say that, the sort of the case weighs heavily on one side and not so on the other. It does raise serious issues. And so why would I not challenge it? If I were taking in this perspective, it's at worst, it's not a clear case either way. Shama?
Thanks, Francis. Manish and Vyapak, what would be your one argument against challenging the award? Manish?
Again, just for the purpose of the debate, we've seen a lot of press in India abroad about expressing views on this issue, and I think the advice to India would be that it is never a good idea to challenge an award based on public or political clamor or the annulment mongering or misconceived notions of blanket state sovereignty. The award is not in the public domain. Of course, India has access to it. As Francis and others have highlighted, India should examine the award and then decide whether there is a legally viable ground rather than a political ground, rather than implications for other disputes, whether there is a legally viable ground here. And again, we can have that debate. But if there is no such ground, then India is under an international obligation under the treaty and otherwise to comply with the award. And I think the argument would be that it must now do so rather than spend more public money on costs and further risk undermining investor confidence in India's commitment to the rule of law.
Yeah. I agree. I think it's a decision, again, like any other commercial organization would take. Yes, the award may be wrong on some counts. It may be affecting certain measures, and fortunately, as we discussed earlier, it has not said that the amendment or the clarification itself is off or is wrong. It is the manner in which it was brought in against this investor that it is held to be violating FET. So I think if the award is giving that leeway of not being precedent for other factual situations, and it is only in the context in which the Vodafone matter went on from 2007, I think any other commercial organization, government also should think whether a good judgment is better than a bad settlement, or at least some way to resolve, or they really need to set the law right. And if that is the case, then yes. Otherwise, it is always better to step back and look at it from a perspective as to what signals government would give to the wider investor community if they move on from this to something else, rather than keep focus on something which is in a way maybe legally right in some view, but from a perception perspective, it is always going to be questionable from a pure investor community. So that's the way I would take a decision on.
Thank you, Vyapak. And a final question before we conclude. not have time for 2 questions that I have in my chat window, but we'll see. The final question to
Actually,
Sophie and Francis.
one of the questions I think we answered, and another also I think is because it talks about limit the taxation measures. I think we have discussed enough and more than enough as to why tax proposed in the new model BIT and what are the nuances and the issues around why any government would want to put taxation measures out of the dispute. So I think we have answered a couple of them already, but maybe we can answer them separately after the session is over as well, individually.
Great. So that leaves me with just one question for Sophie and Francis. What are the key lessons that investors and states must take from the Vodafone versus India case? Sophie, what do you think are the key lessons?
Yes, well, from a state's perspective, the first key lesson I think would be hire this group as a drafting committee for treaties, because we're going to make sure that the taxation provisions and carve-outs are going to be as clear as possible. And more seriously, definitely there is, I think, as our discussion has shown, there is a great trend or tendency by arbitral tribunals to actually extend their tentacles onto taxation provisions, even where carve-outs are attempted. So it seems to me extremely important from a state's perspective to be as clear as it can in its international undertakings on that basis.
Francis.
Yes, I mean, I entirely agree with Sophie, and I think India already has been on that for quite a number of years. In developing its standard form BIT, moving ahead. And so they're very, very conscious about the care that needs to be taken in drafting. And so that's something that India is, it's directly in the crosshairs of India's vision. I guess the only other thing, and that's something, it's very easy to say on hindsight, is that I guess it's quite clear from this case that the Indian tax authorities had a firm philosophy of what would constitute withholding tax, under what circumstances. But unfortunately, the rules that were in place, the black, black ink on white paper, did not support that philosophy. So I think it's very important for, the authorities make the rules. They are the keeper of the rules. It's within their control. So I think it's very important for periodic review, so that to ensure that there is no lacuna or a gap or a chasm between what their philosophy is and what the actual rules mean or say, which is what was shown up in this case, and that had an impact of billions of dollars on the state coffers. Shama?
Thank you so much. What an absolutely riveting session this has been. The Vodafone versus India case does fall critical intersection of exercise of powers by a sovereign nation and rights of foreign investors tested on the pedestal of international law. And in its own distinct way, as all our panelists have suggested, it does attract the classic trappings of the crisis being faced by investor-state arbitration today. I must admit, in our attempt to provoke thought and brainstorm on distinct legal interpretations, our questions may have forced the panelists to take sides they may not have liked to take. And yet all our panelists have been extremely forthcoming and compelling in their case. So I believe that the key to excellence lies at the intersection of knowledge and experience. And we are deeply grateful to our knowledgeable and absolute experienced panelists for sharing their time with us today to discuss the intricacies of the Vodafone versus India case. Thank you so much. I hand over to Vyapak and Smriti to conclude this session.
Thanks a lot, Shama. I don't think I need to say thank you all the speakers, and over to Smriti for concluding remarks.
Thank you, Vyapak. Thank you, Shama. My job here is the easiest job. As someone who thoroughly enjoyed this session, my first job is to thank this stellar panel for giving us this wonderful session. I do think it's time for us to think about a follow-up session once the decision is made public, for I can only imagine the level of discourse after the decision is made public. I also want to thank Nishit Desai, particularly Vyapak and Shama, for being fantastic co-hosts and for giving us the opportunity to collaborate together. On behalf of the AAA ICDR, once again, thank you to all the panelists for taking the time off and to all our wonderful participants for being here and joining us from all parts of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Everyone.